Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 11th of April of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting details and updates, so let's start. And first of all, let's talk once again about the massive missile strike that the Russians conducted during the previous 24 hours. The Russians the Russians attacked the entire Ukraine. Mainly the strikes took place in the western part, in the vicinity of Lvov, Ivano-Frankovsk, in Kiev region, in Odessa region, of course, and of course in Kharkiv area, and Dnipro and Zaporozhye. So the entire Ukraine was under very heavy fire. Later we got some, let's say, picture of missiles and of the roads of missile and drone strikes. As you can see, there are a few colors. There is a blue color that shows us the roads of Geran strikes. We see the red colors, which means the roads of cruise missiles. We have yellow color of probably Kinzhal strikes, and we have gray color of also Kinzhal strikes. So today there were, according to this map, two areas of Kinzhal strikes. The first one took place in the western part of Ukraine, yellow lines, and the bottom, the gray zone, the gray lines, the Kinzhal strikes took place in the southern part. Later we got also some details about the areas of Russian attacks. The Russians were attacking the energy facilities, that was the most important targets, and of course the Russians were attacking the gas storage in the western part of Ukraine, in the vicinity of the village by the name of Stry. And also there was a Burshtunskaya power plant destroyed or damaged, but for now we still haven't received even a single video confirmation of whether the Russians managed to deal any damage or not. And of course the most important videos are coming from Kiev region, more precisely from the town or village by the name of let's say Ukrainka, and this is the video. On this video we can see the Tripolskaya power plant that was damaged and probably destroyed as a result of few Kinzhal strikes. The building and the entire construction was set on fire. Obviously the Ukrainians are no longer available to use this power plant in the future. Furthermore, the Ukrainians very likely are not able to restore or repair this power plant during the next few years, including and furthermore during the special military operation. So another minus another power plant, another difficulties arrived today to Ukraine. Regarding those strikes, regarding the situation, as we discussed, the strikes took place not just in Kiev area. There were a lot of strikes in Odessa region, and for example today we got a video confirming the Russians managed to discover and to destroy another Ukrainian S-300 system, including radar. So, an important thing that whether you know that or not, I would like to point your attention that during the previous few weeks we've been receiving just the videos of destroyed S-300 systems, and we stopped receiving any updates regarding destroyed or damaged Patriot systems or IRIS-T systems. So very likely either the Ukrainians are out of this type of weapon, they were destroyed, or they tried to save them and to hold them in a safe place as long as possible until at least some big events, let's say like a possible Kharkiv offensive operation. Yes, very likely the Russians are going to start the Kharkiv offensive operation. We have lots of updates about the situation. Furthermore, there were lots of strikes in Kharkiv as well, a lot of arrivals, and the military governor, let's call it like this, of Kharkiv area stated that the Russians were bombing Kharkiv using the S-300 missiles, but not just S-300 missiles. There were a lot of FABs arrived in the area, mainly and mostly along the border with Russian Federation. So the Russians are getting prepared for a possible, let's say, operational barrier buffer zone operation. Very likely this operation is going to start let's say earlier than the holidays in May, or maybe right after the holidays in May. Very difficult to understand because everything develops very fast. As you remember, during the previous updates we were talking that very likely the Russians will let's say wait until the end of the Easter and the end of Victory Day, and after these two holidays the Russians will start an offensive. But the number of events that we can see right now along the border line tell us that very likely the Russians are going to start earlier. We have lots of additional evidence confirming this. For example, the Ukrainians from their side continue conducting the reconnaissance operation along along the border. Today they published significant number of videos of FPV drone strikes against the Russian personal carriers, armored vehicles, just regular trucks, which confirms that the Russians started concentration of the forces along the border, and now the Ukrainians try to make reconnaissance operation and discover and destroy. You know that this is very interesting. Kharkiv itself, the Kharkiv offensive operation, is very interesting. If you ask my opinion, I would not attack Kharkiv if I wasn't 100% sure that this mission will be finished completely and successfully. The thing is that if you remember, the Russians decided to start the Kharkiv offensive operation after few attempts from the Ukrainian side to cross the border when the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking Belgorod with cluster rounds, with the Russians suffered significant losses among civilians. So all those Ukrainian attempts to attack Belgorod looked like, at least to me, as attempt to force the Russians to start offensive exactly on this direction. It was like Ukrainian, let's say, plan. Not the Russians, not the Ukrainians were planning to collapse the Russian defense belt and let's say in Belgorod and to capture half of Russia. Of course it's not, because the Ukrainians don't have such possibilities. But it looked like the Ukrainians tried to force the Russians to change all their plans and to start offensive exactly in this area, as if the Ukrainians have prepared some ambush or some trap for the Russians. And very interesting report we got from the region. We got, let's say, lots of reports from today from different sources, pro-Ukrainian, pro-Russian, neutral sources, that the Ukrainians announced evacuation from Izyum, Kharkiv and Bogodukhov districts of Kharkiv region. And the most important from all these things, that Kharkiv itself is not going to be evacuated. So once again, the Ukrainians are planning to evacuate the area in the vicinity of Bogodukhov. This is one of the most important, let's say, railway logistic hub between Sumy and Kharkiv itself. The Ukrainians are planning to evacuate Izyum, this area, and the Ukrainians are planning to evacuate Kharkiv region, but not Kharkiv itself. So this is a very interesting question, why the Ukrainians are not going to evacuate Kharkiv. I thought a lot about this, and I found just one simple explanation of that. You know, the Ukrainians are currently there are 1,300,000 people living in Kharkiv. Yes, and that means that, first of all, from one perspective, this is the best, let's say, human shield that Ukrainians can use to, let's say, stop the Russians. Because if there are so many civilians, of course, the Russians will be reduced in their possibilities of conducting operations in the area. This is the first reason. The second reason, 1.3 million people at some point of the special military operation can be easily turned into 1.3 million's army. Every single Ukrainian who will stay in Kharkiv when the Russians, let's say, will about to encircle or do something like this, will get AK-47 and will be forced to fight with the Russians. Obviously, this is going to be like this. And of course, this is not very good, because this is the reason why the Russians also understand this. Regarding the number of forces they can collect and can concentrate in the area, they will not be able to force say Ukrainians, they will not be able to capture a town with 1.3 million soldiers inside of it, even if there is going to be just let's say women and men and something like this. Obviously this is going to be very difficult. So lots of interesting things. The Ukrainians, as to me, was planning to force the Russians to attack exactly in Kharkiv, not in Sumy, not in Chernigov, not on Kiev, not on Odessa, but on Kharkiv. And probably the Ukrainians do have some plan about this operation. Furthermore, the sources reported, and we have already discussed this in the previous update, that Ukrainians have redeployed significant number of field hospitals in the area. Obviously, the main purpose of the field hospitals is to receive the wounded and to service them and to maintain significant number of wounded soldiers that they will receive during possible Russian Kharkiv offensive operation. So lots of things. Let's move further. Now we are moving to Siversk direction. We have additional reports from the territory. The Russians continue clearing of the landfill. For now, there were no ground operation in the area, just counter-artillery duels. The Russians were suppressing and destroying the Ukrainian positions with artillery systems. The Russians were bombing the Belogorovka itself, but without conducting operation on the ground. And the same story on the southern and the southwestern part of the same landfill. The Russians were FPV droning the Ukrainians, but without any operation on the ground. Very interesting details and updates are coming from Verkhnyokamyanska itself. This is the fortifications, and these are the trenches that we were talking about. If you remember, yesterday we discussed that the Russians were spotted inside of the trenches. The Russians were storming the area, clearing the area out from Ukrainians, and different mappers have already updated their maps showing the additional Russian progress. For now, we are not going to change the color of map because we need more updates, more evidence of Russian progress. But anyway, this is very important, and if the Russians are able to establish control over this stronghold, we see that then they're going to be almost nothing to the west in direction of Siversk. And Siversk itself was also under very heavy Russian fire, very heavy Russian pressure. The Russians were bombing this area heavily with, let's say, artilleries, with FABs, trying to destroy the Ukrainian ammo depots and Ukrainian probably concentration of forces. On the south, we have more updates about further Russian progress and further Russian attempts to clear the area along the railways. Significant number of multiple launch rocket strikes in the area, forcing the Ukrainians to fall back. So very likely soon there are going to be some active phase on the ground. We have the Russians clearing the Razdolovka itself with FPV drones. The Russians are planning to start offensive on this direction, but yet they haven't started. They tried to clear the area with FPV drones. Very likely soon there's going to be something interesting on the direction. And now we are moving to Bahmut Artyomovsk area. For now, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received any updates about any attempts to attack or to, let's say, advance on the ground. Very likely there are some clashes. Obviously, the Russian attempts to storm Bogdanovka and Chasiv Yar itself, but neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians published any updates about any offensive or any clashes in the area. The Russians from their side continue bombing and attacking the territory with Almur missiles, with FABs, with guided bombs, with everything the Russians have. On this video, for example, we see the results of effective counter-artillery duels, and as a result of Russian counterattack, another Ukrainian howitzer was destroyed. The sources reported about the Russians that the Russians began offensive operation in Klishchiivka. The reporters are saying that the clashes are taking place exactly inside of the village itself. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians were trying to clear the area behind Klishchiivka with significant number of FPV drones. The Russians were attacking the Ukrainian, let's say, strongholds, shelters, machine gun positions, and after, as you can see, very close to the Siversk Donetsk-Donbass canal, and after that the Russians launched an offensive. For now, we still haven't received any updates, so let's wait. Now we are moving to Avdiivka area, and we received today lots of very interesting details and updates, as you can see on the map. And first, let's start about Pervomaiskaya territory. The Russians have almost finished the battle for Yasnobrodovka, Pervomaiskaya, Netailova, Umanskaya. The sources reported that the Russians entered Umanskaya itself from the southern part, but for some reasons the Russians decided not to finish the battle, let's say today. For some reason they continue playing with the Ukrainians because the Ukrainians are forced to send additional reinforcements and reserves to, let's say, fight with the Russians, and the Russians destroyed the Ukrainian reinforcement with FPV drone strikes, with artillery. So for now everything fit the requirements. But anyway, regarding that, the battle for this foothold hasn't been finished yet. The Russians intensify their activity on the northern flank of the same direction. So today we got lots of very interesting updates from the area Novokalinova, Keramik, Arkhangelskaya, Cheretina. The Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to suppress, discover and destroy significant number of Ukrainian artillery systems that Ukrainians were using to support their defense forces in Novokalinova. A lot of artillery systems were destroyed, and after such artillery duels, the Russians began another wave of offensive operation, and the sources reported that as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to enter Stepova Street and basically to establish complete control over this territory. For now, we still haven't received any geolocations or any reports confirming this, no any video confirm this, but according to the sources on the ground, this is approximately the Russian control on the territory. So the Russians, by some sources, entered Novokalinova itself, and this is significant progress for the Russian forces. Now they have the window opportunity to move further to the northwest and to get the water barrier and basically to cut this defense belt into two pieces. And when talking about Berdych and Semyonovka, we haven't received anything from direction, just regular FPV droning of the territory from the Russian side. So the same story. It seems that the Russians are playing with Ukrainians, forcing them to send additional forces, and every time everything comes to the area has no chances to then to evacuate evacuate or to run away. Let's few more things about Первомайска, Nitailova, Karlovka. Today the Ukrainians published significant number of videos of FPV drone strikes on the Russian positions, which confirms the Russian control. But the most important, that Minister of Defense of Russian Federation for the third day in a row still has been confirmed that the Russians established complete control over the territory. So if you remember, a few days ago the Russians published the video with the flag, and until by the 11th of April, no updates, no confirmations about full control. Maybe there are still some buildings or streets that are under the Ukrainians. For now, let's wait. Interesting details are coming from the Karlovka water reservoir. As we can see, the focus are moving further to the west, and today the Russians published another video how they managed to but to destroy the dam along the Karlovka water reservoir. The dam was destroyed as a result of very heavy artillery fire, and that attack reduced Ukrainian logistic possibilities. Obviously, the Ukrainians still have some ways to support forces in Nitailova, but now it's going to be much more difficult for them. So the main reason of that attack was to cut Nitailova from the mainland, to increase their logistic shoulder, and to reduce the Russian, let's say, problems and the Russian, let's say, difficulties when storming this village. Krasnohorivka. The Russians managed to dig in deeper in the southern and the southeastern part of the stronghold. The Ukrainians, after a few attempts to attack the Russians, were completely forced to fall back, and now the Russians are thinking and making the plan of movement further to the central part. The stronghold is under very heavy fire of the Russian armored forces, helicopters, aircrafts, artillery, tanks, and after another artillery preparation, after another wave of the bombings, the Russians very likely will try to storm the central part. We see the Ukrainians almost show no barriers, no resistance to the Russians, and this is also another sign, another flag that everything is very bad from the Ukrainian side. Novomykhailovka. You know that I have lots of questions about Novomykhailovka. Obviously, the Russians could have established control over Novomykhailovka a few weeks ago, maybe days ago, but for some reasons the Russians are not in a hurry. They continue just FPV droning the Ukrainians, reinforcements and so on. Maybe the logic is very simple. Maybe the Russians understand that for the Ukrainians it's much more better to fight on the western part of Novomykhailovka than on the eastern part of Konstantinovka. So for them it's much more better to send one wave of reinforcements after another that of course have no chances to return back. And the Russians use this situation because they understand that sooner or later Novomykhailovka will be captured by the Russians, but until that it's better to let's say to reduce as much as possible the Ukrainian army. Maybe something like this, maybe this is the logic. Very difficult to understand what is going on there. Ugledar, we haven't received anything during the previous 24 hours, and we have updates from the southern Urozhaina area. The Russians managed to establish complete control over the foothold on the southern part. The Russians control the southern tree lines. The Russians control some buildings in the area, and very likely the Russians during the next few days will conduct another few more offensives to the north with the purpose to establish control over farms, and then this is going to be a completely different story. So very likely during the next few days the Russians will try to attack along this tree line, the Russians will attack along the main road, and of course the Russians will try to attack along this tree line with the purpose to establish control over every single building and stronghold that located to the south, to the bottom of this red area. And obviously something this is going to happen. During the previous 24 hours the Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian strongholds in the vicinity of Novodonetsk, so another probably points of pressure. Maybe the Russians are going to make some flank maneuvers, a maneuver to attack the Ukrainians from the east, let's say to stretch their attention, to stretch their focus. Anyway, something interesting is going to happen here as well. Rabotina, we haven't received anything during the previous 24 hours, just a regular activity without any, let's say, progress on the ground, any attempts to attack. And that's it about the situation on the ground. We have a few more political updates that I would like to discuss with you. The thing is that the United States of America began selling the weapon to Ukraine. Obviously, the situation is so critical, so they are to start selling the weapon. The Ukrainian energy facilities, energy companies reported about a complete reduce of production of electricity. And if you visit Ukrainian websites, let's say marketplaces, you would see that the most, let's say, the most profitable product right now is some engines, and Ukrainians start buying them once again. The same story as we used to see in 2022, 2023. And the Ukrainians reported that they managed to bring down significant number of missiles, but not the entire batch of the Russians launched, just 18 out of 42. Not so good statistic, as you can see. And as you can see, the Zelensky reported that he is planning to finish the peace negotiations in Switzerland, and after that they will send this ultimatum to Russia. Very likely that a possible ultimatum from Ukraine and the Western countries will be refused and will be denied by Russia. Today, another important thing, the president of Belarus arrived in Russia. Probably he will have some meeting with Putin. Obviously, he's going to have some meeting with Putin, and probably they're going to discuss the possible, let's say, Kharkiv offensive operation that is going to take place very soon. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.